you all today. Um, so without further ado, Carol's already done a wonderful job introducing me. My name is Diogo Verissimo. I work on illegal and unsustainable wildlife products. This on the consumer side of the trade chain, and I guess so. Here, my talk's gonna have three main parts. I know we're running a little bit tight on time, so I'll get to it quickly. You might be surprised to find consumers featured in the symposium because most of the time when we talk about neglected groups, we're talking about biological taxa that have been that receive less attention. But I'm going to start by making the case that even if very often there are these very high-profile campaigns that target consumers, that often these efforts have a lot of visibility, and it seems that they're everywhere. Actually, in the grand scheme of things, they are a drop in the bucket when it comes to effort and conservation work that targets illegal wildlife trade. So if you look at this figure here that talks or that presents where the money goes to in different areas of fighting wildlife trade, this is a report by the World Bank that's online. Demand reduction or consumer sort of facing activities fall under the communications and awareness bucket at the top. And that's the smallest bucket. It's about 5 to 6%. And so it is really quite remarkable how little attention, how little resources we put into that particular segment of the trade chain. I think it's important to, previous two speakers talked about mentioned trade chains. If you think about it in a pretty conceptual way, the consumers at the very end are strategically placed because of course they drive the trade chain. They, if there is a demand for a product, there will be very likely a supply, almost regardless of how many barriers we put in their way. And so despite this sort of critical place that they occupy in the trade chain, we see pretty reduced effort in influencing demand. Now, I want to say just a couple of words about what's going on in terms of demand reduction. As you saw, there is some effort ongoing. What does that effort look like? And what are some of the, because of course that effort, like almost every talk in the symposium will tell you, it's not distributed randomly equally across space and time. So the basis of this is a review that we did. It's out in Conservation Biology. You can find it. But if you cannot find it, let me know. It was based on 236 interventions, and the review was in English and Chinese. It such a number of sources, which I'm sure you probably don't care very much about the details, so I'll just go straight to the chase, which is that we found increased effort. So although it's not huge in the context of IWT in general, there is increased effort. So this last column, 2010 plus, is actually only 5 years, and still it's already more than the previous decade. So that's a pretty good, or makes me feel optimistic that we are seeing a little bit more recognition of the critical role of consumers in this area. But of course, it's not equally divided across space. For example, consumers in Europe and in Latin America and South and Central America see very little effort when it comes to influencing demand for illegal and for unsustainable products there, which I think it's truly a missed opportunity. I speak for, I'm European. There's a lot of wildlife trade. There's a lot of questions around that sustainability that involves that trade. And so I think there's certainly a lot that could be done focusing on consumers in Europe. And so that's definitely a missed opportunity. Now, in terms of biological taxa, again, pretty much the things you'd expect. A lot of effort focused on big mammals, very little on things like reptiles, plants, even birds. Besides parrots, there's a little bit of effort, pretty minimal. The exception there is chondrichthyes, so the sharks and rays. Although I'll say this, that actually that result is very driven by the fact that we found a previous review that did an excellent job at setting out all the different campaigns that had been done, focusing on around shark fin, for example. which I think influences largely this result. So I think this might be a little bit of an artifact rather than anything else. But so having sort of set out this a little bit of what's going on with consumers more broadly, I want to then go on to talk about some of the myths and legends, or sort of the experience that I get reaching out and having discussions with stakeholders on implementing these initiatives, and some of the things that I think are important to discuss and a little bit debunk, because I come across them very frequently. So the first one is that we should target the general public. So very often I come across this idea that what we want is to get the message out to as many people as possible. And that's really the key metric, is as many people as possible. Where actually, very often, if you really look at the groups of people that engage or that consume the product that you're interested in, or the set of products you wanna focus on, that almost, I've never come across an instance where everyone in, say, a city or a country is equally likely to be consuming that product. What's more likely is that there's a pretty defined set of people who are more likely to be engaging in that behavior. And of course, maybe you are getting a message out to thousands of people, maybe millions of people. But if that message is not reaching those key people who engage in that behavior, it's unlikely it's going to be successful. So that, I think, is a pretty important aspect to bear in mind when we're thinking about influencing consumer behavior. If they don't hear what you have to say, then it's unlikely any change is going to happen. The second thing that I come across a lot is the need to use social media. So of course, social media opens up a lot of options and gives you a lot of interesting possibilities when it comes to getting messages to lots of people across the world. But of course, it's not the right answer all the time. So very often I come across this idea that, oh, everyone's on social media, so it has to be the way that we can reach people. Well, again, across the world, there's a huge variation on access to the internet, access to smartphones, and even within the country, you will see more often that what really happens is that internet, access to smartphones, access to all these different platforms is not spread equally across the population. There'll be some groups that have pretty high access and some groups that have pretty low access. And again, if the people you want to reach are not the ones on the platform that you're communicating with, then it's probably not going to work. And so what I really would really strongly advise is to really have a look. I mean, all of these things, one of the beauty of these things is that all of this information is easily accessible online. And so you can test relatively easily if that's a right way for your effort or not. Now, the other obstacle that I see often is this idea that it's a crisis discipline, everything's going extinct, we need to act immediately, there's no time for planning, no time for research. And I think it's really important to bear in mind that without knowing who you're talking to, who you're trying to communicate with, then it's unlikely you'll be able to deliver your message successfully. It's unlikely you'll be able to communicate accurately in a way that is understood by whoever you're trying to reach out to. And so bearing that in mind, and bearing in mind that I think this is really a critical point, the worst case scenario when it comes to trying to influence human behavior is not that your intervention doesn't exactly deliver the change that you hoped. The worst case scenario is that it makes things worse, is that it actually makes the behavior to trying to mitigate more salient, more frequent. And that's not outlandish. It's not a theory. It's not there are several documented cases, mostly in health, where there's more work being done than in wildlife conservation, where these types of things happen. And so it is really important that we plan. It is really important that we understand who we're trying to reach, how the best way to reach them, and that we give ourselves the best chance possible when it comes to implementing interventions that have some chance of succeeding. Now, The other, and this sort of follows from the other, is this notion that we know what needs to be done. We know what the message is. We know who's doing what. We know who the target groups that are engaged in the consumption of X, Y, or Z are. Most of the times based on personal experience. And I think it's really important to recognize that as conservationists, our personal experience is often highly biased because the people around us are not a random sample of society. And so our personal experience often, of course, has initial value to guide us, but it needs really to be substantiated, it needs to be completed, it needs to be, we need to add research to that understanding so we can have a more robust idea of, again, what it is that we're dealing with, what is the context culturally, socially, economically. And of course that does take a little bit of time, and I can certainly empathize with the need to act fast. I understand that very often we are in situations where things are happening very fast, and so we certainly cannot spend too much time idling. But at the same time, it is really important, again, to make sure that we take seriously this idea of first doing no harm, that we are prepared, and we don't really set ourselves up for failing, which I think can easily happen if we go in without really understanding the context. And I think the last one is this idea that it's all about knowledge. If only people knew, if only people had these sort of bits of information that the tiger is in danger, that this is lion bone instead of some other compound, or it's really sort of very sort of information focused sort of concept of what influences people, when actually most often we know that there is a big gap between what people know, what people do. It's really not about giving people more information about wildlife, more information about what's threatened, how many of X species is remaining, or IUCN conservation status of species. It's really much more about connecting with them, having this empathy, and having messages that can resonate with them on a most often an emotional level rather than sort of more factual level. And so I think that's also a really important takeaway, because very often we, as conservationists, we obviously we care deeply about all of those bits of information, the different conservation status of species, the different population sizes, the trends. Of course, for us, it's deeply meaningful. All of those things are really important, but of course, that's not the case for everyone. And I think we just need to accept that it is okay for other people not to be conservationists. It is okay for people to prioritize different aspects of their sort of experience. And so that's really, I think, sort of the key aspects I wanted to emphasize. And really, so if you remember nothing else from this talk, the first one is that consumers have been neglected. Across the trade chain, we see a lot of focus on enforcement around supply, protected areas, all of that. We see some enforcement around borders. We see around shipment, around sort of this sort of middle step of the trade chain. Consumers at the end of the trade chain really have not received a lot of attention, and I think that's I think strategically been a weak point in the way that we've tackled illegal wildlife trade.
12 minutes.
The middle one is that managing demand requires understanding consumers. It's not just about, we don't really have all the answers. As conservationists, we need to ask consumers to help us understand the context in which these decisions take place. And if we choose to ignore that and try to pretend that we know what's going on, I think it will be, we'll put ourselves even more at a disadvantage than we are already. And the last one is that, and this is, I think, really crucial, the worst case scenario for a demand, when you're trying to manage demand for something, is not that there's no effect at all. The worst case scenario is that it backfires and that it makes things worse. And that, I think, really drives home why we need to be prepared why social science is really key in understanding these systems in which we're trying to influence. Thank you very much. I hope this was helpful and useful. Please drop me a line if any of this is interesting. If you want to follow up, I have a couple of papers that summarize some of these points I'm happy to share. And otherwise, I'm looking forward to hear the rest of the speakers of this symposium.